Right? Thanking God for the way that his reminders always hit in the right way. I can feel redundant when I'm repeating material, but when God repeats it, he always does it in the right way. And if we understand the nuance he adds, we don't have to be redundant in our reminders either. And I'm saying that because I want to once again talk about the concept of purpose in Romans chapter 15. So let's go ahead and title it Purpose, as the nuance that I think this chapter adds to it will be clear by the time, God willing, we get to the end of the chapter, which in the first 6 verses is going to talk about an obligation that those who are feeling relatively strong or are genuinely feeling strong in their relationship right now in God, with God, with God. Anyway, you got a responsibility or an obligation to those who are not doing so well. As in verses 7 through 13, he is likewise going to talk about the way that we need to welcome one another like Christ welcomed us. And it's going to be a theme that he uses, I think, at least 3 times in the first 13 verses, that whole concept of like Christ. And so as we looked in a recent chapter about the footsteps of faith, once again, this is another chapter where, as opposed to the footsteps of faith that Abraham walked in, we're going to be reminded that Christ has walked a pattern that we would be wise to understand and pattern our lives after as well. All that aside, verses 14 through 21 are going to go on to talk about the fact that Paul, in spite of the fact that he has written to them boldly by way of reminder in some areas, he's satisfied with their progress generally, as verses 22 through 29 are going to talk about the way in which he hopes to now finally get to see them face to face, those he hasn't met already. As he's going to ask them in verses 30 through 33, the end of the chapter, to pray for him as he tries to make progress on his way there. But going a little bit more deliberately through the verses. In verses 1 through 6, he is going to say those who are strong have an obligation to the weak, just as Christ sacrificed and did not fixate on his own interest in reaching out to us and assisting us in our weakness. Likewise, in that set of 6 verses, he's going to call them to be in harmony with each other, going back to the way we saw that concept of harmony be a thing back in chapter 12. He is going to anchor that, though, not just in being one accord, he's not simply going to encourage them to be in one accord. He is going to ask them to be anchored to a legitimate purpose. That's our title, being one accord in Christ. That's going to be important, God willing, by the time we get to the 1 or 2 themes that stood out to me in this chapter. But again, he's going to emphasize that whole concept of needing to understand the example that Christ has set in verses 7 through 13, as he's going to say, therefore, welcome one another as Christ welcomed you. Understanding his purpose was, even though it was focused on being a servant to Israel, it had a larger purpose, which was the salvation or the inclusion of the Gentiles. That's us, the rest of the world, as verses 14 through 21 are going to say. As we mentioned, he is satisfied that the church in Rome is full of goodness and knowledge for a purpose. Because of that giftedness or that accomplishment that they've appreciated, they are able to instruct one another. And even though he has boldly reminded them on some points, it's not just to be harsh, it has a purpose. As Paul is going to talk about the progress that he has made in his work up to this point, he's going to talk about the way that he wants the work that he has done to cause the Gentiles to produce an offering that is acceptable to God. And so even though he's talked a lot about the grace that God has poured upon us and seeks to have, or seeks to offer to all people, he does not want the grace to cause us to get it twisted, that we can then offer less than our best or settle for mediocrity in our service to God just because he's gracious and merciful and kind. He said, don't get it twisted. The reason why, even in their strength, he's writing boldly about the things they need to make sure to take care of as well, is so that they do not, in my paraphrase, settle for mediocrity in exchange for the kindness that God has shown them. Verses 22 through 29, though, will go on to say that because he has looked not only to make sure that the church in Rome, but all the churches are offering or prepared to make an offering service that is acceptable to God. He has also looked to expand his work out into areas that have not already heard about God or heard about God in the fullness that would allow them as well, my paraphrase, to offer a service that's acceptable to God. That's what's hindered him to this point. But understanding that the opportunities he has had in new areas, or at least the area that he is in, are coming to an end, he is now looking forward to being able to see the church in Jerusalem face to face. The church in Rome face to face after going to Jerusalem to carry an offering that he is delivering on behalf of some of the other churches, Gentile churches, for the poor or the struggling believers in Jerusalem. And after doing that, he's going to make his way to Spain by way of the church in Rome. And as we said in verses 30 through 33, the end of the chapter, he is then going to ask them to pray with him that he be delivered from the difficulties ahead in Judea, that his service likewise be acceptable on behalf of those in need in Jerusalem, so that he may come to them, the church in Rome, with joy and eventually be refreshed in their company, closing out the chapter with a request that the God of peace be with them in the meantime. But I think the things that stood out to me most, as we mentioned, have to do with that whole concept of purpose as it relates to his call for them to live in and move forward together in harmony. Why? Because the unity and the harmony is not enough. The demons, we don't see a whole lot of evidence that the demons are rebelling against Satan, the enemy, but their unity in a horrible or wretched purpose is really just a problem. And so likewise, to the degree we find unity, but we do not find it in a legitimate purpose, we have the potential to simply become a problem. And so the qualification he makes, I believe, in verse 5 is that in their harmony and their oneness, they need to be lined up in accord with the purposes that Christ has set out for them. Likewise, for us as Gentile believers, understanding that in the first 6 verses, once again, his purpose is to look after the needs of the weak, and likewise in the second set of verses 7 through 13, looks like he is talking about even to the degree that we may simply be surrounded by a tightly knit group of people that we get along with. Understand that his purpose is very rarely focused on the best interest of an individual or a narrow group of people. He is saying, much like he was a servant to Israel for the sake of the Gentiles, the rest of us, likewise, we need to have that same perspective. And for that reason, we might all do well to ask God for his help in overcoming the temptation to resist the full scope of what he's called us, as we often say, to do and to be. Understanding that we are in a time that I think for a lot of us reminds us of Paul's warning to Timothy in 2 Timothy, roundabout chapters 3 and 4, where he talks about times when people will not endure sound doctrine. Chapter 4, verse 3. But having itching ears, they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own passions, and will turn away from listening to truth and wander off into myths. Understanding that we may or may not be in those days, but he warns about the abundance of options, even for those who claim the name of Christ. And to the degree that we are seeing this kind of temptation, like we said, it might be good for us all to pray for God to help us expand our vision to the full scope of what he has called us to be, understanding how easy it can be to find those who allow us to place a holy label on all kinds of pet projects and pet interests that we might have, but honestly bear very little, if any, resemblance to the things that Christ actually did or the things that his apostles actually did, which is why we frequently say God's best to you as you genuinely go forward with him.